welcome to our session. This is Data Management and Archiving. My name is Linda Kellum. I'm the head of Research Data Services at the University of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, the person who was going to be chair could not come to the conference. We will miss her, Stephanie LeBou, but I will be here for us all. So we have 4 presentations today. We have changed the order a little bit, so we're going to do the 2 in-person presentations first, and then do the 2 virtual presentations. And I'm saying this so that the virtual people know that the order of the presentations has changed, as well as all of you. If you do feel that you need to leave, feel free, and the bathroom's right there, just as a reminder. So our first presenter today is Jeff Moon, and he is the Director of Data Strategy and Services at Compute Ontario. Prior to this, Jeff was Director of Research Data Management for the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, continuing the work he did with Portage, a national library-based network launched by the Canadian Association of Research Libraries. And before this, Jeff served as the data librarian at Queen's University Libraries, as academic director of the Queen's Research Data Center, and the manager of the Queen's Research Data Management Service. So Jeff will be talking about introducing RDM best practices into advanced research computing workflows. Thank you very much, Jeff.
So is the microphone on? We're good to go? Thanks very much. This is surreal. It's the first time I've spoken in person, let alone in front of live people and such, for quite a long time. So, When Harry Met Sally is a 1989 romantic comedy starring Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan that explores the premise that men and women can't just be friends. Romance always gets in the way. I'm using this as sort of a metaphor for the intersection of research data management and advanced research computing or research data management, 2 terms that I'm going to use interchangeably throughout this presentation. So, when RDM met ARC. So I'm going to talk a little bit about context of where I'm coming from and the time I've spent thinking about this and researching it, a little bit of analysis that I've done, and then finishing up with a discussion which was more of a springboard into further conversations and directions we might go. So let's start with context. We're all aware of evolving research practices, and in my research I found a very elegant way of thinking of it. We had in vivo research, we had in vitro research, and now we have in silico research. And if you haven't heard of in silico, I was quite taken by it. I thought it was just a great way of thinking of how things are happening so much these days. And a lot is moving toward in silico, and HPC is by its very nature in silico research. So I went out looking for HPC best practices for RDM and found that there was very little on HPC best practices for RDM, but there was a truckload of stuff on reproducibility. And for those of you who work in HPC and working with folks who are dealing with big data, reproducibility is God. It's not always achieved, but it's certainly high up there. And that's true for a range of disciplines shown here. And so the articles and things that I found around reproducibility in HPC are all of these different topics. And reproducibility was framed by one researcher, Melson et al., as being repeatable if the same data run using the same code gives you the same results. It's replicable if you use different data and the same code and you arrive at the same conclusions. And it's robust if you use different code and the same data and arrive at the same results. And ultimately, you can land on generalizable, where different data and different code lead you to the same conclusions. So in the context of describing these in a broader way, the first reproducibility or repeatable is bit reproducibility. And some people may think that's the ultimate goal for RDM and so on. And I think in some contexts that's true. You'd like to be able to repeat things perfectly. But in terms of conclusion reproducibility, I would argue that generalizability is probably your best bet. If you can get somebody else's data and your own code to arrive at the same conclusion as somebody else, then you've probably got some pretty good science. So an example of the problem that I encountered in one of the articles was some authors raising questions about the results in a paper from a premier computer security conference. They tried to replicate the algorithms that were in that paper, but they discovered that a variable was used but not defined, that a function was defined but not used, and a mathematical formula had some errors in it. They went to the researcher, but they said, well, I just don't recall what I did in that work. And so reproducibility is just not going to happen in that kind of a situation. So achieving reproducibility is challenging. The cost of repeating computationally intensive research is very high. Software stacks evolve quickly. HPC systems are decommissioned every few years, so you're always churning through different kinds of hardware. HPC resources are allocated competitively, which in some ways discourages replication. Processes run on different computers can yield different results. Data and/or software can be proprietary or otherwise restricted. And software that supports reproducibility may not perform as well as proprietary software that researchers might be more inclined to use. And finally, code changes and data post-processing steps may be poorly documented. So there are a whole lot of reasons why reproducibility is challenging. So I turn to a little bit of analysis. And this is very lightweight research. Don't take me to the task for my lack of academic rigor here, but I wanted to play around with something. So what I did was I looked at these two things, reproducibility and research data management. I'm very familiar with research data management. I was far less familiar with reproducibility. So what I did was I went and looked for things, and I found checklists. And one checklist in particular stood out. It was from a researcher at McGill University, Joëlle Pineau. And she said that probably 50 to 75% of all machine learning papers are unreproducible. And in that context, she said, how do we do something about that? So she came up with this checklist for machine learning reproducibility. And I thought, well, if she's got a checklist, maybe there are others out there. And I was not disappointed. So I did go out and look for more. And at Compute Ontario, I'm no longer affiliated with Queen's University, and I was a bit panicky because I couldn't get in and use all of the databases that a librarian at academic institution would normally get to. But I have a sort of a backdoor entrance into Western University, so I was able to go in and do all the research I needed. I was very, very happy. And Lord knows what I'm going to do when I retire. I'm going to be lost, I think. So I found these, and they're all either directly or very closely aligned to providing a checklisty kind of thing for research reproducibility in the HPC context. And so I took all of these, put them in a spreadsheet because I'm not clever enough to use Python or R or anything like that. And I listed out all of the checklist items vertically in columns. Then I categorized them by these funky colors and try finding contrasting colors when you're sort of visually not that good. Anyway, I went through all of this. Then I grabbed them all and pushed them all over to the left-hand side in groups. And so these were the common themes across all multiple checklists. And I used those to generate this collection with the number of times they appeared in a checklist. And if we reorder those, you can see that there are a range of things that took place in these checklists that are common, and some are fairly unique. And the one up in the top left there is particularly interesting in that if you read through that, what it sort of distills down to is metadata, okay? Which, again, I hope isn't surprising to most of you. That wasn't a surprise to me, but it's really good that it was there. That's at least giving me some hope. So I took all of these and then graphed them, and you can see that there's quite a distribution of these. Metadata appears right at the top, as you'll see. We'll get back to that. But this chart shows in blue the ranked order by count, the number of times a given reproducibility checklist theme appeared across all checklists. And here's the metadata one. And these are the kinds of things that the metadata theme pulled out. And there is a longer list that were specific to that one Joëlle Pineau article that were more machine learning oriented. So I didn't include them here because they were very, very specific to machine learning, but there are more. It also shows the number of times checklists appeared in the 8 checklists that I studied. And you can see that there's a diminishing number there as well. So here are, in red, the themes that appeared 4 or more times. And here are the themes that appeared in 4 or more checklists. I hope you're getting the impression that that top half is where stuff is happening, and the bottom half is appeared more rarely in the checklists, but these are no less important, I think, for us to consider. A lot of themes appeared a few times and or in a few checklists, as I've sort of highlighted at the bottom there. So turning to our discussion. Reproducibility does not equal research data management. I discovered that. But how does it relate? And reproducibility checklists do not equal research data management best practices as we know them. Rather, I think of these as being a subset, one being a subset of the other, and that might not be completely true, and there's certainly overlap between the two. But within reproducibility checklists, we have the ones that I listed, the frequently appearing ones and the less frequently appearing ones. These are the ones that were most frequent. But then we can move out to the research data management practices, and I had to think to myself, what's missing? What is it that's not in the reproducibility list that is common to the practices that we are thinking about when we think of the broader research data management world? And these are the things that I came up with, and I'm sure there are others that I've missed, and some of these actually maybe overlap a little bit, but these are the ones that I thought were somewhat glaring in terms of either their presence or the frequency in which they appeared in the checklists. In addition to that, I found early on in my research this seminal 2017 article titled Challenges of Research Data Management for High-Performance Computing, which you would think is, going to provide a checklist. Well, it didn't really. It talked about challenges. So it wasn't telling you this is what you should do to achieve it. These are the challenges. And so this was something else that I wanted to keep in mind as I did my further thinking. So if we bring the things that I identified as gaps and the things that this article described as challenges together and sort of reorder them a little bit, this served for me as a bit of a springboard, and I'm just starting the work on this now. This is a springboard for further discovery, further thinking about what we're doing. So I decided to start with this, taking 2 of these things and looking at PIDs and workflow integration. And so I wanted to look at research workflows. Now, I've been focusing on HPC, but there are a lot of other workflows out there. And some of those workflows are shown here. These are from a paper that I found. These are from one paper that described these. This is just the standard data lifecycle. 2 of these I've added recently, text and data mining. Thank you to U of T for running a really good colloquium on data mining. And this is another one from data-driven material science. And these combined are, I think, all lacking the PIDs piece a little bit. PIDs were mentioned, but they were not frequently mentioned. So I came across this article, but recently published by Kelly Stathis and others at DataCite. And they talk about this FAIR Workflows project, which walks you through a data lifecycle with a little bit of how do you apply PIDs at each stage for each of these steps within the data lifecycle. And then it shows you the different persistent identifiers all the way around the circle. The ones in red here are DOIs, and the others are other kinds of PIDs. So with all of these, my thinking was, well, we should be pushing this kind of a overlap. We should overlap or overlay this kind of a PIDs workflow on top of all these other workflows, including the one that is focused primarily on HPC, which is this CRISP data management model, but there are others. Another one that I looked at briefly was metadata standards, discovery and storage scalability. Combining these in my head. And one of the things that I thought of there was that if we have an object layer containing metadata, we could use a thing like Borealis to not deposit data, but rather use it to generate metadata, standards compliant metadata for metadata only records for HPC kind of data. And let the storage layer take care of the data, wherever the data is stored, and the discovery and access being the user layer, and have people have access to their data in that way. This is something I'm in conversations with folks at Scholars Portal in Ontario. So overarchingly, we've got all of these things, and if we think about it, we've got the checklist approach with the frequent and infrequent, we've got the gaps that I tried identifying, and we've got the challenges that were identified in that other seminal paper. And it's a question of us figuring out what we're doing with all of these and how we can use this as a springboard for conversations with the folks in the HPC world to identify ways of integrating RDM into their workflows. And so with that, I will stop. We're going to do questions or not, but that's, did I get a 2-minute warning? Am I under? I'm good. Now, that was 56 slides. So you can just, there you go.
So we will do questions at the end, so if you want to jot down any questions you have. Okay. We're going to switch up. Sorry, Jeff.
While we're doing the changeover, when Harry Met Sally was voted one of the top 100 comedy films in history, by and in 2022 was selected for deposit into the Library of Congress for preservation purposes. So I thought that was just fitting.
Nice. Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was great. That was impressive for 58 slides it was? 56 slides.
That's a lot more.
All right. So next we have Christina Kulp. Christina has been the Data Services Librarian at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City for about 8 years. Prior to the Fed, she worked for over 10 years in academic libraries from student to staff to librarian. She has also found ways to apply her library skills during her 23 years in the United States Army Reserves. So, and her presentation is Librarians in the Military, Information Management Lessons Learned During the Ukraine Crisis. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you. Can you hear me? Is the mic working pretty well? Okay, great. So great, that introduction makes my job a little bit easier. I'm going to start with that I have a disclaimer. I've got to say it. This is representing my experiences and my opinions. It does not represent the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City or the Federal Reserve System or the United States military or the United States Army, right? This is just a story of my experience as a reservist in a civil affairs unit. So this is just going to be a lessons learned story. I wish I could say that as a librarian I came and saved the day, but I ended up having this journey where I was applying my skills downrange on a deployment in 2022. A crisis happened on my watch, and things fell apart a little bit, and then my information management skills were not what I hoped for. So I did a kind of analysis of what I thought went wrong, and maybe some ways to do a little bit better. But I do still think that our librarian skills are very relevant in a lot of things that happen. So just so you know, I am at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City as a data services librarian, so that's the range of things that I do, which are very familiar to those of you who do data services, a lot of acquisition stuff and supporting our academic researchers. I also try to focus on the non-tech skills because we actually have a lot of tech experts and I'm not one of them. But I do believe that librarians are a critical connection between our data users and the really high dollar tech expertise that we have available. But it's important to have that connection. In 2022, I was deployed downrange at the United States Army Europe and Africa, or USARAF, headquarters. What this is an operational headquarters that they are responsible for everything the Army does in Europe and Africa. So it's a pretty high up. There's multiple stars on the boss's rank, and so that's where I was at, in Wiesbaden, Germany. My unit is civil affairs. If you don't know what civil affairs does, I like to joke that we apologize for the infantry, but in reality, what we do is we harmonize military activities with civilian authorities, including volunteer organizations and nonprofits like humanitarian organizations. That's what we care about. And then my job was civil knowledge integration, right? Which is right up my skills as a librarian. Manage information requests, organize information. It sounds really easy. Until this happens, right? All of a sudden, we got there in January, and I saw the list of the intel, and oh, crap, this is really going to happen. This map is from liveuamap.com, and on March of 22nd, the invasion happened in February of 24th, of course. And you see all of that red, that is where the combat was happening, but my unit doesn't really particularly care about that. We care about what's happening in the green. In fact, I actually built a map like this. In the green is where people are moving. People are displaced internally within Ukraine, and they're crossing borders and becoming refugees into the bordering countries, right? And so we actually care about all the second and third order effects that are happening in these countries, and including how they spill over into other things like Africa. For example, Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world, and a lot of food programs in Africa were getting their grain from Ukraine. So these are the kinds of questions we wanted to answer. And then also we were concerned about whether we were going to be asked to help out. This is huge and a massive humanitarian crisis, and we have to be prepared. Luckily, we're at the end of the bench, and they didn't really need us because Europe is very modern, and they were able to handle the crisis. But there are a lot of unique challenges that happen. As a librarian, I'm used to data being very slow. Books don't run very fast, right? So so I was caught a little bit off guard by some of these. The need for speed is probably the biggest thing that's going to catch you by surprise if you're helping in a crisis. The second one is your crisis responders are actually usually your data sources. I don't know about you, but I would rather that they help refugees than just stand at the border and count. So you kind of have to be patient and understand that there's going to be a bit of a delay. It's hard to tell that to your boss, who outranks you, but there's sometimes a delay in them getting that information to you. The fog of war, we've all heard that phrase. It's very hard to figure out what's going on near time, real time, especially at a distance. Information that comes at you quickly is often still in rumor mode, and you don't know if it's true. By the time you figure out it's true, it's outdated and old. Then the next one to really keep in mind is that open source information may suddenly be slammed behind a closed door. And this actually really happened to us. I was stumbling around and actually came across a website of Ukrainian grain elevators. Luckily, that website got taken down several days later, because if I can find it, so can the enemy, right? So be prepared for information that used to be open source and available to you to all of a sudden not be available. And so that's kind of some of the challenges. And some of your processes that you think are going to work fall apart. And that's where the story really begins, right? So there I was. And there's a lot of things that happened, but I decided to focus on these two because I thought they were useful. And that is, we had a lot of unanswerable questions. We had a lot of people walking in with complex questions that they wanted very quick answers to. I don't have a PhD, but I work with a bunch of people who have PhDs. And a lot of exaggerated expectations, which leads to disappointment when the staff can't deliver what leaders want. And allows analysis paralysis. Everything's important, so 100 projects get started and none of them get finished. Then we had a storage problem. Everything turned into a giant junk drawer. People got impatient. They tried to keep everything. Information was tracked in documents that they didn't have time to read, so they tried to save it, couldn't find it later. All those data sources were disconnected. The military just doesn't have the sophisticated tools, not on the front lines anyway. And everybody defaulted to their own storage system, and nobody could find anything. And here I am. And I realized that this is all human nature. People want to be in control of something in a crisis. They want to contribute in a crisis. So all of these problems are because people cared, right? But there are limits to technology, right? I know there's a lot of you who are going, there's technology tools that exist to solve all these problems, and you're right, they do, but it's too late when a crisis occurs. It's too hard, most of us know, it takes too long to get new data in, and unfortunately, the first thing that tends to drop off is a lot of knowledge and information management best practices. People stop maintaining websites and SharePoints because it's just too time-consuming, especially when it's an additional duty. So what can you do about it? Well, when I tried to look back and say what was really happening to us, I realized it's information overload, right? And there's been a ton of research on this, and it's been out there for a long time, but until you find yourself in that situation, it's hard to recognize it, and that's where we were. I found this really interesting article that broke everything down into triggers and manifestations and consequences, and this really everything on this slide happened to us. Right? And all the triggers were present, all the manifestations. For example, we definitely had poorly defined information needs, right? There's the unanswerable question problem. Certain characteristics of information I wasn't used to were causing trouble. We had emotional and cognitive issues. People got stressed out. We had some people that would try to do 20 hours a day trying to read everything under the sun, and others were like, it's 3 o'clock, I'm going to the gym, right? Because they were so frustrated and they just checked out. And so information overload, when it happens to you, it's surprising. Why did it happen? Well, the best example I could come up with is a common phrase that Clay Shirky is the professor that said this, It's not information overload, it's filter failure. And this was the one that makes sense to me as a librarian, right? He said that basically we've always had too much information ever since someone invented movable type. And then, but in the pre-internet, the cost of information and printing and distribution, that created a natural filter system. Those of us who have been in library long enough remember back when we used to manage daily newspapers and weekly magazines and monthly journals and all these annual books. And so information naturally got filtered. With computers, a lot of those filters we were used to went away, and maybe in some ways haven't necessarily effectively been put back into place. So a lot of people are getting access to information without it being filtered at all, right? There's not a lot of options as for dealing with information overload that I could find. Excuse me, I'm on the long tail end of a cold. So there wasn't a lot of the organizational and the passive stuff. That's all technology, so we didn't have time. The only thing was to try and implement some sort of active filter. And the definition for filtering that I thought was really useful. It's a disciplined and systematic attempt to focus on relevant information from chosen sources by specifying criteria for immediately removing items from consideration. But that means that the user has to know that they're applying a filter. And that filter has to be something that they have some sense of what it is they're doing. So I was trying to figure out, well, how can I do this better? And I decided to tie the filter to the trigger, because saying apply a filter doesn't help. But if you think about what's triggering the information overload, maybe that's going to help. This is an example of an actual question I was asked. As you can see, looking for an org chart to map out international NGOs working in the ground in Eastern Europe. That's a really, really, really vaguely worded question. Almost every single one of us would immediately jump into reference interview mode, right? But we don't always have access to those people. I did give an answer. Luckily, the United Nations has a cluster system for all of the organizations that tend to respond to these crises. And they've already pinned the tail on the donkey of who was responsible for all of these things. So if you care about water and sanitation, talk to the head of UNICEF first, right? But I have no idea if that's really what they wanted. So I realized that the filter that we were missing was a decision-making filter, and that I needed to lead up and lead my peer groups into getting them to focus more on what it was they wanted. A lot of these are familiar to us as librarians, but not as familiar to some of the people we're working with. For example, time, depth, and breadth. We all understand what that is, but a lot of the people we're working with don't quite get that. Oh, I know, it's priorities and risk. You've got to get them to pick what matters to them the most. And the thing I found also helpful was the Colin Powell rule. He said that if you have about 40 to 70% of the information in a crisis, you have enough. Less than 40, you're just guessing. More than 70, you're stalling. So the key is create focus on what's decisive and have discipline to ignore your wants. The second one is the characteristics of information. And this forced me to realize that some of the strategies that I might pick back at home in my quiet little workspace just don't seem to work when I'm in this type of environment. The biggest one for me was speed, how fast information came at you and how long it was actually relevant. So fast information is only good for a couple of hours or maybe daily. Moderate information is weekly or monthly, like somebody's phone number, someone who's coming and popping in and organizing a crisis response and then leaving. And then the slow information that you want to retain or archive for the long time. I know. And then, of course, how recent is it? Is it accurate? Is it still rumor or something's been vetted? And did it come from someone who actually has the authority to be gathering the information? And then the military world, maneuver speaks map, so you always have to have some sort of pin on a map. So this is a huge, busy slide, but the bottom line is that I really wanted to say that I tried to focus on filtering based on speed. And I realized that one of the key things I needed to do was actually separate the information. We love to talk about one-stop shops and putting everything in one place, and that's what they even say they want. But that's where the giant junk drawer syndrome was coming. Information that was quickly outdated was filling up these folders, and the information that was still relevant was buried and hidden. And we didn't have access to sophisticated knowledge management systems. So I had to get them to understand that if it's fast information, read it and delete it. Let it flow by you. Don't be Lucy and Ethel in a chocolate factory trying to stuff chocolate in every corner and crevice that you've got. But you want to just be patient and only pick it up unless you know it's useful. Otherwise, other stuff, I had some people who are literally throwing everything into OneNote. entire presentations and everything. It was crazy. And then they came to me and said, I can't find anything. Well, I can't help you at this point. This is your storage system, not mine. But I had to try and get some sort of system in place, and we just didn't have one that was available at the time. But you need some sort of system. I thought that this would be helpful here because overload happens on campus. You actually have thousands of mini little crises walking around campus all the time called graduate students, right? And many of them find that they are involved in information overload. They found that a lot of them feel like, and they're experiencing overload. The other thing I thought was really interesting was when I do some research, is that this quote, in the past, censorship worked by blocking the flow of information. In the 21st century, it works by flooding people with irrelevant information. We have bad actors who are flooding the system with noise in order to hide information. And this is why information overload and finding a better way to deal with it. And it may mean thinking differently about how you store your information. As librarians, I believe that regardless of whether you got tech skills or not, we still have librarian skills. In the early days, maybe we thought of ourselves as guides in the wilderness, but now I think the paradigm shift is we are actually lifeguards in a sea of too much information, right? What we can do to help is recognize when someone is walking in with information overload and look at the triggers that they have. We have some of the skills. I would say that the most important thing is set them down and conduct that reference interview and get them to focus on what is the most essential aspect. If they don't understand the research question or haven't talked to their principal or whatever, get them dialed back in on their needs, right, and not their wants. The other thing is help them apply filters, and like I said, the idea that worked for me was the triggers. And also teach information overload in literacy classes. That was one thing that graduate students asked for a lot. So if it isn't in your information literacy class, you might want to consider adding it and promote any knowledge management tools you do actually have accessible, but know that it might not work. So in a crisis, information overload happens, and technology is not always available. It's human nature. We want to do something. We want to be in control. And sometimes what works when it's nice and quiet doesn't work when it's crazy. So like my firefighter brother-in-law always says, walk, don't run to a crisis. Walking makes it look like you're in charge, and it gives you time to assess the situation, recognize the information overload, look at what's triggering it, and apply your librarian skills and help people apply filters based on what's triggering it, and be disciplined and weed out the noise. So that is the lesson that I learned while I was in Europe. Did I make it? Yes. Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. Yay. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the audience questions, do we use that one? Okay. And we need to switch to the okay. I'm going to try to do this. Great, thank you. We're going to switch over to our first virtual presenter. The first presenter is AJ Million. Is AJ online or? Okay, awesome. I'm just going to, while this is changing and all that, we're doing a documentathon in our group, our team. Pointing to Zhaj because she works with me in a couple of weeks and might apply some of the principles that you have there during our documentathon. Hi, AJ. Do you want to share your screen? Oh, he is? Oh, okay. Oh, move to webinar. Yeah. Oh. Awesome. Hi. How are you?
can't hear you right now. Sorry, AJ, you're our first remote presenter of the day, so we're just going to get some things set up, and I'll do an intro for you, and then we'll pass it over. Good to go. Okay, AJ, can you test your mic just to make sure? Yes, I can. Awesome. You're a little low, but we're going to get you up. Okay, great. No, you're good. Thank you so much. That sounds great. Hi. So, yeah, thanks, AJ. AJ is the director of the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data at the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, ICPSR, at the University of Michigan. His academic research examines topics such as public sector information technology use, scholarly communication, knowledge infrastructures, research data management, and libraries. He has published in the Cataloging and Classification Quarterly, College and Research Libraries, First Monday, IASSIST, or GESIS, the Journal of Library Administration, Political Librarian, and OCLC Systems and Services. And we will give you signals in the chat for the 10, 5, and 2-minute marks, just so you know. And we're doing questions at the end. Okay, so handed it over to you, and his presentation is Successes, Pain Points, and Lessons Learned when Curating Data at Scale, the NACJD Experience.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to giving this presentation. It's going to be mostly conversational, if you're how I present. Not heavily academic, because I'm mostly interested in kind of telling the larger story that I think has some implications and for some of you and maybe interested to know about. So my primary job at ICPSR is to manage what's called NACJD, the National Archive for Criminal Justice Data. And what I'm just going to focus on is just what the title says, some successes we've had over the years, some pain points and lessons learned, curating data at scale. And I really want to emphasize this curating data at scale piece. So just to start out and tell you a little bit about NACJD, we are a funded topical data archive at ICPSR. We're supported
Thank you very much, AJ. That's great. Up next, we have our last presenter is Kathrin Behrens. Kathrin did her PhD in sociology, analyzing constitutional documents regarding national and religious identity. Since August 2021, she is part of GESIS, working on the development of research data management competencies for data curators. And her presentation is a competence matrix. Oh, that's cute. A competence matrix for data curation. Thank you very much.
So first, the second, can you see my presentation? Please give me a short sign.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your presentation.
Perfect.
Okay.
That's the best case scenario for the beginning.
So we have a mic that we'll need everybody to use because of our virtual attendees. Please, if you could, if you have a question for one person, direct the question to them, say who you're asking for, and also if you could introduce yourself, that'd be helpful. I can run the mics. We have okay. So we have an online question. Are they able to, they're going to do chat, or how are they? Yeah, so if you have an online question, please write out your question in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to take it that way. Any questions right now? Okay, well, I'll let people come up with some questions. I have one question. I'll direct over to, first, Christina, if you could talk about your filters. That was a really interesting way of kind of how you would filter information. I was wondering if you use those categories, if those categories, other people, you made them aware or trained them in how to use those categories, or how that was told to the people who would be going through the information. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, for the categories that I was creating, it was really hard to get people to actually listen and implement the decision-making filters. And ironically enough, the military even has something called the military decision-making process. And we failed to implement our own procedures. So I think, for me, I think those decision-making filters or other types of filters, I don't think they have to be, you know, a specific type of filter. They can be applied to the situation. It's really important to pay attention to why they're feeling overloaded in a crisis situation like that. And I think for us, one of our things is we were so desperate to do something, but we just couldn't, we didn't do enough analysis of what our role truly was. And that's what led to those unanswerable questions where people would just run in and I heard someone talking about this. And so I think, you know, the things I brought up there as examples, those were just some common ways of getting people to understand, do you need to know a lot about a little or a little about a lot? You know, are you making a decision based off of something being ticked, or are you having to react to something? And that can change what you do with the filter. The other key thing is time. Obviously, now if you have a ton of time, maybe we got 3 months to figure this out versus we got 3 days to figure this out. So I don't think there's any preset filter. And I think the challenge for me was I had to do a lot of leading up, and part of it too is that I didn't realize it until after the fact, and when you have time to go back and look, you know, hindsight is 20/20. But I think really, yeah, that I don't think there's any set filter that I could come up with. It really had to fit the situation.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Is this working? Okay. Thank you to all the presenters. That was really fantastic, all 4 of them. My question is for Jeff Moon. My name is Shira Kerr. I'm a data curation librarian at the University of Victoria. Jeff, I really appreciated your presentation. And I have experience working with researchers and framing, you know, RDM through a reproducibility lens, and that being a very effective way to communicate with them. I'm curious, in your research, in terms of like the high performance computing world, in terms of communicating with like IT staff or like developers, were there other sorts of angles that appeared in the literature? So like other challenges you referenced, like around like the time and energy it takes to run or to execute analyses on high performance computing machinery, like framing RDM, say through like an efficiency lens or like a time saving lens. Did that come up at all, or do you have any thoughts on how to communicate with them through that sort of technical lens?
Thanks, Shahira. That was an excellent question. In 2 weeks, I have to give another presentation. I'm going to be giving another presentation in the Compute Ontario Summer School, and I've got just a myriad of articles that I've gathered up over the past little while that I'm going to try and fold into more thoughts on that. And I think I'm going to take your efficiency lens and see if there's more out there. I do think there's a general understanding among the folks that I've dealt with in the former Compute Canada, now Alliance, HPC staffing, which numbers over 200. So, and I'm only really dealing with the folks in Ontario. I do think there is a sense that RDM has a place. I also have a sense that they think they're doing it to whatever extent. I think that we need to continue to socialize some of the RDM best practices that we've got in mind, which is sort of my list of things that I think we're somewhat missing from the checklists. But this whole notion of if you do this, your pain will be less, the price you pay will be less, therefore you'll be more efficient down the road, both for you and for researchers. But yeah, HPC is something I'm learning more about every day. And so for me to delve into that any more deeply than that is probably unwise. Thanks.
Additional questions?
Hi, my question is for AJ. How do you track the amount of time it takes to curate a data set? Just I guess like a little bit of context for my question is like when I'm curating, I use Jira tickets, but I don't know if it's like the best representation of how long it's taking, because then it can be like, you know, months that it's sort of in the queue, and I don't know like how helpful that is in trying to like express how long something takes. So
That's a really good question and a really challenging one to deal with, because you hit the nail on the head right there. So I see a couple of our curators are actually on the call here. So Katie Pillars, she's on, she might be able to say something. But I can tell you from my experience, from what I do know, is kind of twofold. One, we do use Jira tickets too. We can calculate it that way, but it's hard to measure things based off of gaps because not everything's done in one go. So it's like you may work on one data set and then you may have other ones that you have to pivot to and work on, and things get bumped. And when you're trying to do it at scale, it gets even more challenging because sometimes you're dealing with these administrative data sets that bump things out of the line. So that's a whole nother layer to it there too. Um, what we have done is, at least I've looked at it from an administrative perspective, is way less elegant. I've looked at our levels of curation, so 1, 2, and 3, and we do these broad buckets that are kind of fuzzy targets, and we know that they're roughly ground truths, though there are certainly some exceptions, and we say, well, a level 1 study should take X amount of time, a level 2 study should take X amount of time, and we use that to prioritize things. But our curation team handles a lot of the details behind the scenes. I think what's really interesting here, and this is separate before I kind of back off and see if anybody else wants to say anything, is that just from my administrative perspective and trying to talk with my contacts at DOJ and talk with my project managers, and then just trying to plan for my archive, it creates a lot of room for miscommunication and not understanding what resources are available and how fast things can be done as compared to the alternative. Like, so it's not just widgets. There's a lot of work that has to be done, and there are always things that throw things off. So we can get close, but there's a bit of an art to it. It's not all of a science.
Thank you very much, AJ. I have a question I'm going to send over to Kathrin. If you could talk, I was just curious whether or not you've piloted the competencies in any way, or if you have plans to do that and how it's gone, if you have.
So, as I said in the presentation, the paper accompanying the framework is under review for now. So I hope for a lot of feedback from this point of view. And additionally, we had at our department, we had an internal talk to two data creators and get their feedback on the perspective on the content of the framework. And the next step is to model some trainings around the framework or parts on trainings. So some module-based training aspects for our products on IBM Compass. But that's the next step, and we are really looking forward to test the framework regarding the training options. So it's in process, I would say.
Thank you very much. It looks like Katie Pillars chimed in and said they also use Jira and track actual calendar time. I'm doing this for the recording, just so, and agree there are a lot of challenges in tracking and measuring curation time, as well as deciding what is counted in curation effort. Amen to that. Are there any questions? More questions? Yeah, Fleur.
Professor Moon, a short question for you. You've spoken about the crisis of reproducibility referring to machine learning. You understand? You referred to machine learning and you've spoken about the crisis of reproducibility. That's okay. I want to ask you if you think that machine learning is difficult to document because the researcher has no more the exact knowledge of what the programs do. This is this sense. It's just a question from one that old man that if I don't see if then else in a program, I start to think there is no a program. That's sorry.
So you're in effect asking me the equivalent of still, Jeff, explain how artificial intelligence works. I don't know enough about machine learning or other than to know that it's all dependent upon the data. Sorry, my voice isn't loud enough. I keep thinking I'm loud enough. Is the microphone on? Okay. I don't know enough about AI or machine learning to really know what's happening in behind the scenes, but the people who wrote those checklists do. And when I look at them, some of the things are, and I have them in sort of in the background in my PowerPoint. You know, how are you training the algorithm? How are you training the AI? How is the machine learning happening in the background? And that's the if-then loops and such that we're talking about. I was in a Python session yesterday where we were talking about if-then-else loops, but that's about the limit of my understanding of how that might work. But the data are all important. And again, if the data are managed well and we know exactly what are in the data, then we'll know the shortcomings of the data and how that might influence how biased or how exclusive or inclusive the machine learning or the AI might be in the end. But again, I'm dipping my toe into this space, not pretending to be any kind of an expert.
Any more questions? Oh, Josh, yeah.
I wanted to add to that because that was an interesting question even I had. And in natural language processing, which is part of machine learning, and large language models are based on this, there are checklists called model cards, which are available interfaced with Hugging Face, which is a repository. And the model cards have specifications which are quite similar to the high-performance computing, but there are certain differences in how is the data collected, especially if it is multilingual data or under-resourced languages data, then how there are some variations in how that is documented. But it is a very interesting question to think about that way as well. Oh, yes, I am Julia Karachkikar. I am the data science librarian at Penn Libraries. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Seeing none in the chat. Any in the chat? Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for our presenters. These were really fantastic presentations. I'm really excited, especially excited to see the PowerPoints that when we get those onto Zenodo, so please send those on. And they're all very awesome projects. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Seeing no last questions, I just want to thank everybody, and we are going to have a coffee break for those in person. Hopefully you have coffee at home or tea or maybe rest for the day. So thank you so much, and have a good day.